After the war, many in Germany survived on less than 1,000 calories a day. One evening, a hungry child was handed a piece of chocolate by an American soldier. The wrapper made a tiny crackling sound in the silence. In a city of ruins, that sound meant hope had...
May 1945. In the American zone of a shattered western German town, the air still carried the sour bite of brick dust and wet ash. Twilight pooled in bomb craters where rainwater reflected the broken teeth of rooftops. Somewhere nearby, a military truck idled, its engine note steady and indifferent, while a field kitchen gave off the faint, impossible smell of coffee. Thin, burnt, unmistakably foreign to streets that had not known abundance for years. In a doorway blackened by fire, a young widow stood with her coat pulled tight, watching strangers in olive drab move through the ruins with clipboards and rifles, boots crunching glass that once framed family portraits. This moment mattered because it was not simply the end of a war. It was the beginning of an occupation, and occupations are where ideologies are tested in the quiet spaces after the shooting, where propaganda meets reality, where hunger meets policy, where ordinary people learn what victory looks like when it arrives at their threshold. In April 1945, American planners had instructed their commanders to be just but firm and aloof, and to strongly discourage fraternization with the German officials and population, reflecting the fear that the defeated nation might still conceal organized resistance and the conviction that Germany must be remade, not comforted. Avalon Project, Yale Law School. For many German civilians, especially women who had already buried the old world in telegrams and silence, the Americans were not yet individual men. They were a single, looming idea. The Third Reich had taught them to expect humiliation, vengeance, and the cold mathematics of collective punishment. And many American soldiers arrived with their own expectation: that Germans would be sly, unrepentant, and dangerous in defeat, the human residue of a regime that had consumed Europe. The U.S. Army even issued a blunt instructional film to occupation troops warning, "Every German is a potential source of trouble. Therefore, there must be no fraternization with any of the German people. You will not associate with German men, women, or children." Yet the first shock of 1945 was how quickly those expectations collapsed against what the occupation forces actually saw. Not marching columns and banners, but infants with swollen bellies, old men pulling carts of rubble, and women whose faces looked older than their papers said they were. The widow, one of millions created by a war that had devoured an entire generation of husbands, had learned to measure time not by dates but by ration lines. Her days were the scrape of a cooking pot, the panic of winter coal, the dull arithmetic of hunger. Official rations in the western zones could fall to levels that contemporaries described as hovering at the edge of starvation. A scholarly review of occupation-era nutrition reports notes summer 1945 ration levels
American soldiers had strict orders:
roughly between
do not
700
befriend German
and
civilians.
1,190
But when they saw
calories
starving
in the
children
Western
in the streets, many soldiers ignored the rule. Instead of hatred, they gave
zones,
candy,
and later
chocolate,
surveys
and a small taste
reporting
of
ranges
peace.
such as 840 to 1,400 calories, figures far below accepted health baselines. Austin College, Artemis Repository. For the American soldier, fresh from combat or from months of marching through a continent turned into graveyard geography, Germany was supposed to be the enemy's lair. The training told him to remain aloof. The policy told him to distrust the outstretched hand. The war itself told him that pity could be fatal. And still, on streets like this, it was impossible not to notice the difference between a defeated army and a defeated people. In the first months after surrender, civilians in the American and British zones were often described as receiving around 1,200 calories a day, while non-German displaced persons could receive higher emergency rations through international relief mechanisms, an imbalance that revealed how moral categories shaped food itself. The widow had not come to plead. Pride survived even when furniture did not. She stood because she had learned that stillness could make her invisible, and invisibility could keep her safe. But on that evening, the American truck's tailgate was down, and a few soldiers were distributing something small to children who hovered at the edge of the light like cautious birds. They were not supposed to be friendly, officially. And yet in the gray zone between orders and conscience, a different kind of power was being displayed. Not the power to destroy, but the power to give. The object was simple, a rectangle wrapped in foil and paper, a chocolate bar. It is difficult, decades later, to explain what chocolate meant in a Germany of 1945 without making it sound sentimental. Chocolate was not merely a taste, it was proof. Proof that somewhere the war had not eaten everything. Proof that an industrial nation could produce food not only for survival but for pleasure. Proof, more unsettling still, that the enemy could afford generosity. A historical photo captioned in a German documentation project notes that although American soldiers were officially banned from fraternizing with German children, American soldiers were friendlier, particularly because their pockets were usually filled with candy and chocolate. The widow watched her small child, thin, disciplined by hunger into quietness, step forward. The soldier did not speak in this telling. The era itself provides enough words. He simply extended the bar. The foil caught the last light like a fragment of a different civilization. When the child took it, the wrapper made a faint crackle, a dry sound that seemed almost obscene in a city. Memory because it was the sound of surplus. It was the sound of something not being counted down to the last gram. Here, the emotional contrast sharpened. German civilians had been taught that American capitalism was decadent, exploitative, brittle. They expected occupiers to arrive hungry for revenge, ready to grind the defeated into the dust. American soldiers, for their part, had been taught that Germans were uniformly complicit, potentially treacherous, and not to be trusted with friendliness. The film shown to American troops framed the German hand itself as contaminated by past crimes, and urged soldiers not to clasp it. But what both sides encountered in the rubble was not an ideological diagram. It was a human landscape, one where a single piece of candy could carry more political weight than a poster. The widow did not eat the chocolate, not that night. In many households, sweets were rationed not by law but by ritual. A mother saving the best for the child, a child too stunned to unwrap it, a family turning a bar into a week of tiny shavings. She folded the wrapper carefully. Even the paper had value. Even the foil could be reused, patched into a lining, traded, or saved like a relic. And without fully realizing it, she had chosen her symbol. Not a flag, not a gun, not a slogan. A chocolate bar, wrapped evidence of American abundance, carried in the pocket of a soldier ordered to be aloof. This was not an isolated gesture. German recollections gathered by the U.S. Army's own public history writing described children waiting along roads for passing vehicles, then being handed candy, chocolate, and bubble gum, like treasures, and later receiving school lunches supported by American-linked aid such as care packages, details that show how quickly food became a language of occupation. U.S. Army. The widow did not know the acronym CARE yet. She only knew that her child's eyes looked different holding that bar, less like a survivor's eyes, more like a child's. Around them, the machinery of occupation turned with bureaucratic patience. Germany in 1945 was not only a country of ruins, it was a country of people in motion, millions unmoored. The war had created an immense displaced persons crisis, and at its end, around 11 million displaced persons were in Germany, including liberated concentration camp prisoners, forced laborers, and prisoners of war. Another historical synthesis notes that at war's end there were approximately 11 million DPs in Europe, with about 8 million located in Germany. Numbers so large they strained the meaning of the word after. The National WWII Museum. In this environment, the widow's private grief was part of a national condition. She wore black not only for her husband, killed, missing, or swallowed by a front that had retreated into chaos, but also for the old Germany that had promised order and delivered annihilation. The occupation authorities feared disorder now, not only from Nazis but from hunger itself. Reports and testimony cited in historical research show officials acknowledging ration scales around 181, 225 calories in 1946, and describing conditions very close to starvation in the words of a U.S. Army official during Senate hearings. Austin College, Artemis Repository. And still the American soldier kept encountering the same scene. Children watching, women waiting, old men silent. The occupation's non-fraternization posture was meant to keep moral distance, but distance is difficult when a child's hunger is visible. The soldier's training insisted suspicion. His eyes insisted evidence. Each time he reached for a chocolate bar, he felt the contradiction. The same nation capable of leveling a city could also produce a sweet that survived the journey into that city's ashes. The widow began to see patterns. Americans arrived with rules and rations, yes, but also with logistics, with systems, with an administrative determination that contrasted sharply with the collapse that had preceded them. Even the act of counting, registering residents, inspecting buildings, cataloging wreckage, felt like a form of rebuilding the world into something legible again. For a woman who had lived under a regime that demanded belief and punished doubt, the occupation introduced a new kind of authority, one that could be argued with on paper, appealed to through procedure, resisted with documentation rather than whispers. This was the slow beginning of transformation, not conversion, nothing so simple, but erosion. The widow had grown up with stories about the chaos of the Weimar years, the hunger and humiliation that made extremism feel like rescue. Now she lived through a new hunger, but its cause was no longer explained by propaganda alone. The ruins were physical rebuttals. They made lies heavy. In the morning she queued for food, and in the evenings she listened, because sound mattered in 1945. The steady drone of an Allied vehicle, the occasional shout of an order, the distant hammering of someone salvaging nails, and sometimes, very close, the crisp crackle. That crackle became her metronome. It marked the difference between scarcity and surplus. It also marked the difference between the promises Germany had made and the reality America embodied. The Reich had promised a 1,000-year future. It could not provide bread. The United States had promised, in German propaganda, only exploitation. It arrived with food that could be handed to children. The American soldier's expectations transformed, too. He had been taught that Germans were not our friends, that friendliness was fraternization, and fraternization was weakness. But the widow's eyes were not the eyes of a fanatic. They were the eyes of a person managing loss with discipline. He had expected defiance. He found exhaustion. He had expected a population still intoxicated by ideology. He found people sobered by rubble. The evidence of that sobering was everywhere. Allied policy documents emphasized denazification, demilitarization, and the removal of Nazi influence from public life, an attempt to prevent the old system from regenerating under new names. Avalon Project, Yale Law School. Yet the occupation's moral challenge was that the German population was not a single moral unit. It was a spectrum: believers, opportunists, resistors, victims, bystanders, compressed by defeat into the same ration lines. The widow stood somewhere in that spectrum, and like many, she did not fit neatly into the categories soldiers carried in their heads. Her husband's death, however it had come, was part of the larger arithmetic of war. But widowhood in 1945 was not only grief, it was vulnerability. It meant navigating a black market that thrived because official systems could not fully feed cities. It meant guarding children. It meant enduring the social suspicion that often attached itself to women who survived when men did not. It meant living in a society where many institutions, police, courts, schools, were under scrutiny or suspended, and where survival sometimes required cooperation with occupying authority. So when the widow first came into formal contact with the American soldier again, it was not romance, not sentiment. It was procedure. She was summoned, like many civilians, for registration, for housing allocation, for work assignment, for question damaged building, a ration card. In that setting, the soldier was no longer merely a silhouette on a street. He was an agent of a system that, however harsh, was at least functioning. This is where the story's shock began to take shape, not as a sudden twist, but as a series of small reversals that made observers uneasy. The widow had been conditioned to expect conquerors to behave like conquerors. Instead, she saw Americans wrestling with policy versus conscience. The soldier had been conditioned to expect Germans to be uniformly hostile. Instead, he found that hunger and motherhood could strip ideology down to its bare bones. Food in this landscape was never only food. It was governance. The debates inside Allied policy, how much to feed, whether feeding enabled resurgence, whether deprivation punished guilt, were debates about the future of Europe. Historical research discussing U.S. occupation policy records the severity of rationing and the fear that hunger could destabilize society. It also preserves the chilling clarity of some officials' attitudes about suffering as a lesson, while simultaneously warning against mass starvation. Austin College, Artemis Repository, the widow did not read those memos. She felt them in her bones. And beyond German civilians, displaced persons lived in camps, some in former military barracks, some in spaces once used for persecution, waiting for repatriation that was not always safe or desired. The Aralson archives describe the Allied goal of repatriation, and note that by the end of 1945, about 6 million DPs had been repatriated, yet many refused to return due to fear of persecution, political realities, or the loss of any home to return to. National WWII Museum likewise emphasizes that refusal to return was fueled by political, economic, and psychological factors, including fear of Soviet punishment and resistance to communist systems. The National WWII Museum. In towns near these camps, German civilians and DPs sometimes existed side by side in uneasy proximity, each group looking at the other through the lens of hunger and history. The widow heard rumors that DPs received higher rations, that foreigners were being fed while Germans starved, that justice had become another form of arithmetic. In some accounts, civilians in the Western zones received around 1,200 calories early on, while non-German DPs received substantially higher rations through relief channels, illustrating how the occupation sorted human need by moral category. And yet the widow also saw in brief glimpses people who had survived the Reich's machinery, walking skeletons in striped cloth, eyes that carried knowledge beyond hunger. The moral landscape grew more complex, and the simplicity of wartime propaganda began to dissolve. Through all of it, the chocolate bar remained her recurring measure. She kept wrappers tucked away, flattened and folded, not as a childish souvenir but as a private ledger of a new reality. When one appeared, it meant a day when her child's mouth tasted something other than turnips or thin soup. It meant a day when occupation felt less like punishment and more like a strange, reluctant mercy. For the American soldier, the chocolate bar meant something different. It was part of a ration system that could afford sweetness. It was also a temptation, an instrument that could turn aloof into human in a heartbeat. He understood, perhaps without articulating it, that giving away chocolate was a kind of political act. It signaled power, but also restraint. It showed that victory did not have to be performed through cruelty. This is where the widow met him in the deeper sense, not merely seeing him, but recognizing that he was not what she had been taught. Recognition is not affection. It is the beginning of reevaluating what you thought you knew. That is a dangerous act in any society emerging from dictatorship, because it forces the mind to admit it was once captive. The occupation authorities tried to maintain boundaries. Official directives discouraged fraternization, warning soldiers against familiarity with German civilians. Avalon Project, Yale Law School. The training film's language was severe, framing friendliness as peril and insisting that Germans must prove they were cured before being allowed back among respectable nations. But history is made not only by directives, also by the daily friction between rules and lived reality. And reality, in late 1945 and 1946, was hunger that did not care about ideology. Research summarizing occupation nutrition surveys states that urban and industrial areas could be worse. Hit, with many civilians relying on official rations of around 1,000 calories or less in some periods, and that reports near the end of 1946 concluded fewer than 1,500 calories had been officially available to most adult German civilians during the year. Austin College, Artemis Repository. These numbers were more than statistics. They were the slow thinning of bodies, the dimming of tempers, the weakening of immune systems as winter approached. In such conditions, shock did not always come from dramatic acts. It came from the quiet inversion of expected roles. The widow found herself, against every inherited story, depending on the occupying power not only for order, but sometimes for the survival of children. Accounts of post-war German childhood memories describe American-linked school feeding and care packages as life-saving, and recall that candy and chocolate handed out by soldiers meant the world it helped us survive. U.S. Army. As months passed, the widow's relationship to the American soldier, still not described here as romance, still shaped by the constraints of the time, became something that others noticed. A widow was expected to remain in a certain posture. Quiet, resigned, loyal to the dead, cautious around occupiers. An American soldier was expected to remain aloof, suspicious, contained. When those expectations loosened, it unsettled both communities. Not because the bond was loud, but because it suggested that the war's moral boundaries were becoming permeable. And then, in December 1945, Washington passed a law that revealed something profound about America's long game. The War Brides Act, enacted on December 28, 1945, intended to expedite the admission to the United States of alien spouses and alien minor children of U.S. service members, exempting them from restrictive quota systems and facilitating their passage. The National WWII Museum. With it, the post-war world acknowledged that soldiers did not return home unchanged, and neither did the people they met. The widow learned of this not as an abstract statute, but as a rumor that moved faster than official notices, that some German women were leaving, that marriages were happening, quietly, sometimes controversially, between occupier and occupied. It sounded impossible to those who still lived entirely within the emotional architecture of the war, and yet the law existed because reality existed. The National WWII Museum notes that nearly 300,000 women and dependents came to the United States before the expiration of the War Brides and similar acts in December 1948. The National WWII Museum. Here the story reaches the point that would have shocked everyone in a ruined German street. Not that a widow could feel hope again, but that hope could take the shape of the enemy's world. For many Germans, America had been the Reich's caricature. Jazz, chewing gum, soulless factories, racial mixing, moral decay. Now America appeared as paperwork, policy, and a chocolate bar unwrapped beside a bombed wall. It appeared as a nation capable of projecting power across an ocean, and then writing laws to bring foreign spouses home. This was not the behavior of a conqueror satisfied with humiliation. It was the behavior of a society that believed, however imperfectly, in the portability of its domestic life. The widow's transformation was not a clean conversion to a new ideology. No honest post-war transformation was. It was more like learning to breathe in a room where the windows had finally been opened. She still carried grief. She still carried guilt, personal, communal, national, because Germany's crimes were not abstractions. They were documented realities that emerged more fully as the camps were revealed and the scale of atrocity became undeniable. But alongside grief and guilt, she began to carry something else. The recognition that democracy could manifest not only in speeches but in systems that fed children and processed petitions and allowed, eventually, the rebuilding of civil life. The American soldier's transformation was equally complex. He had arrived with a mandate to distrust. He found himself in a world where distrust alone could not govern. He learned that occupation was not simply the extension of war, but its moral aftermath, the requirement to keep people alive while dismantling the structures that had misled them. The chocolate bar became his recurring symbol too, though in his pocket it meant different things at different times. At first it was a ration, then it became a tool of mercy. Then it became a reminder that power could be expressed without cruelty, and that restraint could be a form of strength. They lived inside contradictions. Officially, fraternization had been discouraged. Avalon Project, Yale Law School. The instructional film had insisted on suspicion and distance. And yet the same occupation apparatus that tried to keep people apart also created points of contact. Administrative offices, aid distribution, labor assignments, school programs, translation needs, rebuilding projects. If archival footage is used to visualize this era, it often shows the blunt surfaces. Troops moving through streets, civilians watching, the steady presence of uniforms among ruins. Newsreel collections like British Pathé's short segments titled Occupation of Germany, 1945. Capture the texture of occupation as a public spectacle, tanks, signs, rubble, while missing the intimate politics of hunger and small mercies. YouTube British Pathé. But the widow's story, composite in its shape, faithful in its elements to documented realities, unfolded in those missing spaces. It unfolded in stairwells where neighbors whispered. It unfolded in ration offices where women learned to negotiate with paperwork instead of slogans. It unfolded when children learned new words. Skakkalade, said with an almost reverent caution. Care, learned later as a label on packages. Amerikaner, no longer only a threat. And because this was Germany in 1945, nothing came without shadow. Some Germans resented these relationships, seeing them as betrayal or moral collapse. Some Americans condemned them as naivete. Some occupation officials feared they undermined discipline. And beneath social judgment lay something colder. The memory of what Germans had done in occupied countries, where food had been seized and populations starved. The hunger now experienced in Germany could be interpreted by some Allied voices as consequence. Scholarly discussion of U.S. occupation policy records the tension between punitive impulses and humanitarian concern, capturing how feeding decisions were entangled with moral judgment. Austin College, Artemis Repository. Still, the widow's household became one of those places where the future quietly began. The child grew stronger. The widow learned to measure Americans not as a monolith but as individuals, some kind, some harsh, most simply tired. The soldier learned to measure Germans not as a collective enemy but as a society in ruins, capable of both denial and rebuilding. What shocked everyone was not merely that a German widow could come to trust an American. It was that the instruments of American democracy, law, procedure, civilian family life, extended themselves into the rubble of a defeated dictatorship and offered a route outward. In the end, the War Brides Act was not only a family reunification statute. It was a quiet assertion that victory would not be finalized, drawing former enemies into the ordinary machinery of American life. The National WWII Museum. When the widow finally prepared to leave, if she did, as tens of thousands did, she would have carried few possessions. Post-war travel was a stripping down. Papers mattered more than furniture. A suitcase mattered more than a house that no longer existed. She would have carried photographs, perhaps, if they survived, a document folder, a child's clothing, and somewhere, folded small, the flattened foil wrappers, kept not because she was sentimental, but because they were witnesses. In that sense, the chocolate bar became symbolism in its purest form. Not a childish treat, but a recurring object through which abundance revealed itself, through which an ideology became tangible. Democracy, in the widow's experience, did not arrive first as philosophy. It arrived as a system that could produce enough that a soldier could afford to give sweetness away. It arrived as a law passed in December 1945 to expedite the admission of foreign spouses. The National WWII Museum. It arrived as the steady hum of trucks bringing supplies, as school lunches, as the possibility that a petition could matter. Meanwhile, Germany around her continued to heave with displaced lives. Millions of DPs had to be repatriated or resettled. Many did not want to return home, fearing persecution or political realities. The very definition of home was being renegotiated in camps and offices across occupied Europe. In such a world, a widow leaving Germany was not simply a private story. It was part of a broader migration of shattered identities searching for a place where survival could turn back into living. Even for those who stayed, American influence seeped into daily life in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Care packages and occupation-era feeding programs were remembered by German children as lifelines, and candy handed out from jeeps became a recurring memory marker of when the enemy began to look less like an executioner and more like a complicated benefactor. U.S. Army. The candy was not the whole policy, but it was the part policy could not easily control. The widow's final transformation was therefore not a simple acceptance of American virtue. It was something harder and more historically honest, a recognition that systems matter, that abundance can be produced and distributed, that a society's values can be read in how it treats the defeated, and that ideology becomes believable only when it is embodied. The Reich had embodied itself in banners and violence and the theft of food from others. America, in her narrow field of vision, embodied itself in paperwork, rations, and a chocolate bar offered without a demand attached. And the soldier, looking back, if he ever did, years later, might have remembered Germany not only as the place where a war ended, but as the place where he learned what victory required after the guns fell silent. He might have remembered that the hardest part of defeating an ideology is what comes after, feeding people who once cheered it, teaching restraint to men trained for force, replacing fear with procedure, replacing slogans with civic life. In the epilogue of such a story, the camera does not linger on parades. It lingers on small things, a mother's hand smoothing foil, a child's careful bite, a wrapper tucked into a book like a pressed leaf. The sound, always that sound, the crackle of paper and foil in a ruined stairwell. Because in 1945, freedom was not an abstract word floating over Europe like a victorious hymn. Freedom was, for many, the first day they tasted something not issued for survival. Abundance was not greed, it was the capacity to share. And democracy at ground level was not a speech. It was a system that could afford, even after the greatest war in human history, to put sweetness in a pocket and let it fall into the hands of the hungry. The widow's world had been built on a promise of conquest and purity, and it ended in ash and ration lines. The American soldier's world had been built on a promise, imperfect, contested, sometimes hypocritical, of civic life continuing after catastrophe. In the space where those worlds touched, The chocolate bar became a quiet, recurring testimony that ideas do not only win with bullets, they win when people can live inside them. And so the larger truth settles, as it often does in history, not with thunder but with a small human sound. The crackle of a wrapper in the dark, proof that the future can arrive, even in ruins, carrying something as simple as chocolate and something as enormous as the possibility of beginning again.